Excellent, and welcome to TADSummit. We are very fortunate to have the Czar of TCPA world on, Eric Troutman. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely, and I apologize for my unbecoming background here. I'm in a shoddy hotel in Dallas, Texas for this, but for you, Alan, who I love, I'm happy to join from anywhere in the world.
Excellent. So we have a broad audience across the US, international. So I'm really happy to have you here to help educate a lot of, we have service providers international that are looking at the US market from voice, SMS, also a lot of businesses that, again, international, but they've got US customers and they want to communicate with them. So helping them understand the complexities that is the US market would be really good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when you're thinking about the US market from a telecom perspective, you've got the entire Communications Act that you need to think about. But really, where I focus is something called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act. And this is both consumer and business facing when you're doing B2C or B2B marketing primarily, but also servicing and debt collection calls, any kind of outreach to a phone via SMS, MMS, or of course, voice channel. The TCPA, that's going to be the primary federal law that's going to apply. And those of you internationally, you may or may not know this, but in America, you've got the federal law that kind of sits on top of everybody. And then you've got state-specific laws that also are like an overlay on top of the laws from the federal government that apply at the state level. So you're going to have to kind of think through both levels. But just at the highest level, the federal level, the TCPA, the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, that's going to be your primary body of law. And it governs the use of regulated technologies to make outreach. And we'll talk about what regulated technologies are here in a second. And it also governs the use of calls to numbers on the DNC list for marketing purposes. Here in the US, maybe elsewhere as well, but here in the US, there is a national database of people who say, I don't want to be solicited to, I don't want cold calls, and they put their phone numbers on this list. And it is illegal then for telemarketers to call those phone numbers for marketing purposes unless you have express consent and established business relationship or the consumer has made an inquiry to you. But that's on the DNC side. I think more interesting for most folks is the regulated technology provisions, where you're talking about the use of an auto dialer, pre-recorded call, artificial voice message, or any form of AI. Any of those kinds of messages, regardless of their content, are going to require some form of consent. And if they are marketing messages, you're going to have express written consent to use that regulated technology to contact a consumer or business, I should say. You have to have express written consent to use that regulated technology for marketing purposes. If you are going to just do an informational message or a transactional message or a servicing message or an MFA or a fraud detection message, all of those also require consent, but these are going to be express consent, which is a lower level of consent. It doesn't have to be in writing. It can be oral. And then as you kind of break down a little bit more in terms of what these consents look like, and the marketing consent, it's not just, any old writing will do. You also have to have 15 now under the new law that's going to come into effect in January. There's 15 different things, components that consent needs to have in order for it to be valid under the fairly complex regs from the FCC. Okay. If you are really interested, you can go look at it. 47 CFR 64-1200 F9 is the current definition of express written consent. It's going to change come in January. And as I mentioned, there's 15 things you're going to have. Among those is the name of the specific seller, that is the good or service provider that the consumer is agreeing to hear from ultimately. So even if you are serving as a platform or a go-between or a BPO, the name of the ultimate seller that's going to be providing the good or service to the consumer needs to be on that form. And if not, then the call is illegal, presumptively. Even if the consumer is like, yeah, I want to hear about mortgages or whatever, and you're a mortgage company, it doesn't matter. If your name is not specifically one-to-one selected individually on that form, that call is going to be illegal. So I think I've kind of given an overview. Happy to kind of break down any of these pieces that you'd like to go to, but that's at the highest level. That's the TCPA. And I guess I should mention, if you violate this law, this very complex, convoluted law, it's $500 per call. That is your penalty. Up to $1,500 per call is your penalty. And here in the United States, as you probably all know, we love to sue each other. And so we've got a very aggressive plaintiff's bar There's something called a class action here, which I know is very, very unusual in different parts of the world.
Yeah.
But here, one person can sue, and in that lawsuit, they can claim to represent everybody else that suffered the same harm or received the same phone call. So it's very common. It's crazy, but it's very common that you get one wrong number phone call, you get one person that didn't want that phone call, and they'll sue a big brand, a big business for billions of dollars, right? So it's millions of calls that are made times $500, and it can literally go to billions of dollars in these cases. It happens very commonly, and essentially that's what we do all day is defend companies in these lawsuits because it's just ridiculous.
Yeah, exactly. Now, TCPA came into existence back in, was it 1991? So it's actually quite old, the law?
Yeah, that's true. But so 1991, the TCPA came into existence. That's correct. It was primarily focused at that time. Remember, I told you there's two provisions on the DNC provisions, right?
Yeah.
And so people would put their numbers on the list, and the telemarketers would stop calling them. And every once in a while, you'd see a case pop up. But for the most part, way back then, there was really very little litigation around the DNC provisions.
Yeah.
People just, honestly, like the plaintiffs' lawyers weren't that sophisticated. If the cases were being brought, there's a debate whether you could even bring them in federal court or you had to bring them in court, and whether or not class actions were even permitted. And that was, again, just on the DNC side. The regulated technology provisions, the way they were written, most people assumed that they only applied to like random fire dialers. And so for many, many years, nobody even brought suit. It was like 20 years before the first lawsuits under the regulated technology provisions of the statute were ever even attempted.
Gotcha.
And it wasn't until 2011, right? So you're talking, you're 20 years into the statute, right? Yeah. 20 years into the statute before the first auto dialer lawsuits were brought. Gotcha. And for 2011 to 2015, you started to see quite a few of these cases coming in. Yeah. And then 2015, the FCC basically threw the doors open and were like, yeah, absolutely. These any dialer that calls thousands of numbers at a time, that's covered by the TCPA, even though the language of the statute doesn't seem to read that way. Yeah. According to the FCC, that's what it covered. And these lawsuits just went through the roof.
Exactly. Because as a consumer, I signed up back in 2003 when the do not call list appeared. Yeah. And it had no impact. I signed up and I still receive calls. I don't even know if I'm still on the list, whether I've aged out of the list or, because again, it as a consumer, it's hard to know, where do I go now? Because before there was so much publicity, so much interest, we can stop telemarketers. And I signed up and we didn't stop telemarketers.
Well, it is interesting. So going kind of all the way back to you folks know, United States, we've got this thing called the First Amendment, which protects speech, sort of. I don't know. Depends who you ask or what day or who's in the White House. But in theory, right, the reason the DNC list was required is you couldn't just ban telemarketing because technically telemarketing is free speech, right?
Yeah.
And so there was a case from the U.S. Supreme Court back in the 60s called Martin versus City of Struthers. And in this case, it did not involve phone calls. It involved people knocking on your door. Oh. And there was a town ordinance that banned essentially soliciting door to door. Yeah. And the constitutionality of that ban went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the U.S. Supreme Court held that a town could not ban solicitations. A government cannot silence speech across an entire community, right? Oh. Now, the court also held that an individual homeowner could put a no solicitation sign on their door and prevent people from knocking on the door. Gotcha. So this body of law is what was the impetus for the DNC regulations, right? Congress couldn't just ban solicitations to cell phones, but they could create essentially a nationwide sign that you can put on your phone, right? And that's exactly what they did. They empowered consumers to put the number on a DNC list. To your point, I think it hasn't worked the way people wanted it to work. But one of the reasons, honestly, that it hasn't worked isn't because telemarketers just ignore the law. Some do. But, in my experience, most telemarketers and companies doing direct-to-consumer sales are trying to follow the law. They know about the telemarketing sales rule. They know about the TCPA. They know about the DNC. They're not trying to violate the law. They believe that they have consent because there are these websites, right? And some of them are legitimate and some of them are not. comparative shopping websites, other websites where people go online, they fill out a web form, they insert their name and their phone number, right? We talked about this earlier about the new express consent rules, right? And the disclosure requirements, what's in there. So in many instances, right, a telemarketer will buy what they call a lead, right? One of these web forms that's filled out by a consumer, and they'll make an outbound call. And maybe this is what happens to you, Alan, right? Sometimes people fill out a form, they forget they fill out a form. The problem is once you fill out a form, like these consents are good forever, right?
Yes.
And they'll get sold hundreds of times,
exactly.
In the current environment and for years and years and years. It's a terrible thing. And, again, some companies are better than others, some websites are better than others, but the worst of these abusers, they're just very abusive. And they really do. They trick consumers. They're click farms. Some of these are click farms. Consumers don't even know what they're signing up for. And then once they've got their data, they just use the fine print to sell it thousands of times. It's a terrible thing. And so we've created, not to kind of pivot to something else, but we've created the organization R.E.A.H., which is Responsible Enterprises Against Consumer Harassment. R.E.A.H. is an organization of companies that are in the space, in the marketing space, right? Both digital advertisers, content producers, publishers, networks, affiliates, and then ultimately the lead buyers. All of them are members of this organization. And the concept is we're going to clean this whole industry up, right? We're not going to let consumers continue to be taken advantage of in this way. It's a terrible thing. We're going to set rules and standards for what the industry is going to accept and what it's not going to accept. And in that way, we've hoped to stop billions of robocalls, right? And the nice thing, Alan, is since we've started this organization, we have seen a drop of over 2 billion robocalls in the United States, right, year over year from before the organization existed and had set standards. Now, I don't know if this is a complete but-for cause, but I know it's not a coincidence. I know we are making a dent here. Did we stop all 2 billion? Probably not. But did we stop hundreds of millions? I think we have. And so, if anyone's interested in getting more information about that organization, it's reachmbc.com.
I'll include a link when I do the little weblog on this.
It's important to know that we started that not too long ago, and the list of members is the who's who. And from my standpoint, without R.E.A.H. and the Czar leading it, small business has no chance. We just had a podcast. We just had a gentleman on talking about the future of business messaging and RCS and where things are going and the amazing growth that's going to happen in it. And you represent 70% of small business in America, and they're being targeted because of SIM farms and pig butchering and romance scams that are all happening through these foreign groups with SIM farms, which is another conversation. And I honestly, America has one chance. And I heard a rumor that if there's a new administration, you might be getting a cabinet position because small business America is the lifeblood of this country. And for everybody out there who doesn't know the Czar, he's the only guy that I'll tip my hat to, period, full stop. I have all the respect in the world. He's fighting for the little guy. He's fighting for America. And F you, if you want to take advantage of us. And Czar is the only hope you all have. So I watched that organization grow from 0 to 100. Alan doesn't like when I talk, but it's not too many chances that I get the Czar, my favorite, on my podcast, and by far the smartest attorney out there. And if he did run for president, I think he'd win.
John, I love you, man. No cabinet position in my future, but you're right. Look, I love the small businesses. They are the superpower and the backbone of our economy and this country, and I will fight for them. And I will continue to fight for them. No question about it.
I think there's some new information coming out that we want to get in your hands that you understand just how unfair the targeting has become. And it's really about regulators wanting to catch the operators in a catch-22, admitting on certain problems they have, and instead just pointing at you guys like, oh, stop those guys, stop the telemarketers. God forbid they should buy something they don't want. Come on, it's insane. I mean, and it's only going to grow. Messaging and business messaging.
Coming back to R.E.A.H., so how many partners or members do you have in R.E.A.H. now?
We get about like 85 or 90. We're growing.
I remember when you had 4 when you first started. It's amazing.
Yeah, and we're doing. Look, we're still, in my opinion, we don't have the saturation that we need yet in the industry, and I think some of that is that this organization is new, right, and this industry is not new. right? This industry has been around 15, 20 years with no real representation, no cohesiveness.
Exactly. Well, it was actually, it was late 80s when it was dinner time calling, because both parents were out working. The only time you could catch people was during dinner time. So that's when basically telemarketers were calling into that home number, because that's the only time you could catch people. So it's been around for
these
40
groups,
years.
they operate, they're kind of at war with each other. They're at war with the world. It's hard for them to kind of work together because they're just always so like, everyone hates us, and it's just everything's so combative. It's like, no, calm down, calm down. Like, we can do this. We can work together. We can do it the right way. We can change the narrative here, because you know what? People are mad, and to some degree, they're mad for a good reason. So don't be so defensive all the time, right? Like, let's be thoughtful about our approach. Like, we do have a good narrative. We do have something to sell. We do something that's right and good, that is a superpower for our economy. But if you're going to be pissy every time someone throws a stone at you, then you're not going to get your way, right? We've got to be thoughtful about this. And so that's the whole concept behind R.E.A.C.H, is to get kind of people together, get them working on standards that are going to help them come to market more broadly and convince consumers, win back their trust, win back their respect, that we're not bad actors, right? We are doing something that's ultimately good for consumers and good for the economy, but we've done it in a bad way in the past, but we're going to fix that, right? And that's the whole concept of R.E.A.C.H, like trying to really fix things, make it a holistic ecosystem where it's sustainable, where people want to pick up their phones again, where the phones matter, and we're not just all going to OTT services, right? The public switch network is still going to matter. Hopefully, 10 years from now, it's still going to be here. And to me, R.E.A.C.H is a big part of that.
No, that's excellent.
Let's not lose fact of how many ambulance chasers that you stop from destroying people's life with these TCPA suits. We just had somebody who joined our podcast who's coming after you, Mr. Quilici, who came on our podcast, talked about how they tried to destroy him and how you defend these companies that don't know where they're going. So you look, I'm a huge fan of Czar, R.E.A.C.H, 85 customers. I mean, a year ago when we had you on and you had the most important podcast in telecom American history, and said the things that you did that have definitely made a difference. People need to understand and recognize, and from 4 to 85 groups is pretty amazing. And look, Small Business America, and now with your podcast that you did last night, you got to put that up. It's insane on the revocation. I mean, and we talked about a little about that with Noah on TNID.
Gotcha.
It's just it's game time, and it's important. What you're doing is important, and we thank you as Americans.
Thank you.
I follow TCPA world. It might be good to help people understand what that blog does, what it covers. I mean, it's fun as well. I think it's fair to say that Eric is a showman of the highest order. So it's always entertaining, but it's always insightful on a lot of the coverage, keeping you up to date, because this is a rapidly moving area in, if you're doing customer outreach, the rules you have to follow, because it's become highly political over the last couple of years. So FCC, of course, is a political organization, so they're constantly basically doing knee-jerk reactions to the elected representatives when they're ranting at them.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, those of you that don't follow kind of U.S. politics very closely, the truth is, obviously everything's political, but it's really become more political. Take the FCC, for example. You go back 20 years ago, and the FCC, yeah, sure, it had Republicans and Democrats in it, but by and large, this was an independent, apolitical organization that set sound policy for the country based on telecommunications expertise. Like that's what it was. Yeah. And there are still lifetime staffers there, good bureau members, who actually do care about the country and not party and are busy toiling away, doing good, hard work. But increasingly, you're not wrong, that at the higher levels, right, it's increasingly partisan. And when one administration takes over, increasingly you're seeing these big swings back and forth, and policy changes. And now net neutrality is there and it's gone and it's back again, right? And that's unfortunately just symptomatic of kind of our larger political environment right now, which is very unfortunate in my view, but whatever. But leave that alone. Ultimately, what it comes down to is that's just one small piece, though, of what the point is, which is the speed at which the telecom law in this country changes. And it's incredible because, the Communications Act from back in the 1930s, for 80 years, I mean, you could take a napkin and write all of American telecom law on a napkin, and like that was it. Like there was no treatises, there's no books on American telecom law because there was none. It was one act, it was one thing. And from 2011 until 2024, you could write 150,000 pages and you still couldn't cover everything that's happened because of the incredibly rapid rise of regulation and litigation around this area of law. And what, again, many folks in different countries might not understand is that, the United States is just saturated with different levels of law. I already told you about the federal level and the state level, but you've also got the administrative level, right, where the FCC kind of essentially just writes its own bodies of law. And then, of course, you've got the judicial level, where, those in common law countries, this will make sense to you. Those that come from different countries where it's all code-based, it's not going to make sense. But the judges make their own law all the time, right? And every time a judge makes a law based upon interpreting a law that was passed by Congress or the administrative state or by a state, then other judges may or may not follow that law. And then sometimes it gets appealed. And so you end up with like this patchwork of hodgepodge rulings defining different terms. And you never really know, which is scary, what's legal or what's not legal. And that's why, you get a great attorney like me, dare I say, and we're kind of like magicians. Like we conjure things up from like this weird fabric or like metaphysics. It's just bizarre. Because really trying to pin down what the law is on any given day is so challenging because of all of these layers that we're dealing with. And so I, of course, am just deeply fascinated with all of this, and I love to share information. I love to keep people informed. And so we created TCPAworld.com specifically to provide like real-time insights, real-time information to everyone in the whole wide world for free, right? No barriers. You have to sign up. You just visit the website and get information. And every time a new case comes out, we blog it. Every time, many times that case is filed, we're covering it. When the FCC does something, we are always on top of that. When the Congress does something, we're on top of it. When a new state passes a new law, we're on top of it, right? Again, not legal advice, but just like, hey, this is what happened. Take a look at this. This is what happened. And you're right. We try to make it fun. We try to make it interesting. Most importantly, we try to make it accessible, right?
Yes.
Like my goal is I'm an attorney, but I was so sick. I was in big law my whole career until very recently when we started Troutman Amin, which is my current law firm. I was so sick of the pretense and the baloney with these lawyers. And it's just like the way they talk. It's like, just be real for like 35 seconds in your life, man. Like just help people to understand something without trying to put on airs and have this weird heightened language. Just tell them what happened. And so we really try to be plain speak. We really try to be engaging and accessible so that people can really understand what's going on. Because, one of the core, to Johnny's point, if you really want to fight for people, if you really want to empower people, you empower them, right? You say, this is what you need to know. Here it is. Take it, learn from it, use it, be stronger. Knowledge is power. And I'd love to give people power who really deserve it and who otherwise, wouldn't have a fighting chance out there.
Exactly.
Well, you're using your powers for good. Like I always said, our next guest, if you and YouMail ever got together and decided to go batshit crazy on the plaintiff's side, you'd the country with all the money you'd make. So the truth is, that I commend you guys for that and doing what's right. And you better come back on my podcast. I know I keep harassing you all the time. I'm like a groupie, but you better come back on, Czar, soon. Because we need. Let's wait till after the administration. I'm thinking you might after the new election. I think you might be getting a cabinet seat. I don't know. I heard. I'm in Queens. I hear things.
Yeah.
Just saying.
Okay.
Just saying. Some people find out about all the good work that you do for Americans. There are people that still care about Americans, and small business is America.
Yep, absolutely.
70% of our people.
So again, Eric, thank you so much. We're now going to move on to the next presenter who is already here.
Now, Eric, you're welcome to stay on. Alex is on, who's a friend of yours, and right down the street from you, from YouMail, another superhero of sorts, in a different respect. And look, you are. Don't blush, Alex. I like your hairdo, by the way. And you're welcome to stay on. It's just a running day event. Obviously, I know you're busy, and I know Alan can't pay you $4,200 an hour to stay on, but he won't cut his hair. He will sell blood for you.
So unfortunately, I love you guys. I do. But before I do want to say hi to Alex because I do love Alex. I love the work he does. Even though he refuses to give R.E.A.H credit for the precipitous drop in robocalls, He just refuses to give me credit for it, and that's fine. I guess I just have to
You
accept
might want
that.
to stick around for 30 minutes. I actually put real numbers together for these guys on some slides, and we'll see where everything's actually going. So
I got
Yeah.
your back, Czar, here.
Yeah, this is the problem with Alex, man. He always lets the facts get in the way of a good story, and we just can't have that.
Numbers are your
Uh,
friends, but excellent. Again, Alex is CEO for YouMail, one of the few measurement companies on spam robocalling, because I learned more about Bending Spoons, who bought RoboKiller, but all I can say is RoboKiller is no more because I can't get any of their numbers. I was talking to one of the partners, and they are still active. Where they are supporting them. So it's not dead, but as far as I'm concerned, because he used to publish some great numbers, I can't get access to them. So now, Alex, I'm wholly dependent on you and Truecaller.
well, that's good. So I'm happy that we're still producing numbers. So guys, so what I actually did for this is we always have a great conversation, but I put some slides together.
Excellent.
And I wanted to document where things are for everybody. And there's two parts to this. So let me share this. If I can share my screen here somewhere.
Yeah, you'll see the share button at bottom, middle. There you go.
All right. So there you should see. Okay,
yes.
Good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I put some together and said, okay, where are we with robocalls now? Like the real truth, how they're dividing up, what they're doing, where we've made progress, where we haven't, and my proposal for the three things that would actually solve the problem.
Cool.
I don't think Eric's going to like all of them, but
I'm going to hate this.
It's they're documented in facts. So, okay, where are we now? Look at the numbers. Like everybody's seen this chart a million times, right? This is what we put out all the time. And, I thought it'd be good to look at it from the perspective of what's actually happened with robocalls. And in the long run, we've come down from the peaks. That's good. We're 25% below the peak. And there's kind of a general downward trend, including recently. So we've kind of got to a new plateau. That's good. The bad part is look at all this stuff that had to happen to get here, right? Stir, shake, and rolled out at a tremendous cost. There's a ton of regulation, as Eric well knows. I don't know what NPRM we're on, 8, 9, something like that. There's been a ton of enforcement with the Traceback Group and our help with them. The FCC shutting carriers down essentially with C&Ds, these huge fines, and all this know your customer stuff. And what did it do? At least on the surface, it made a 15% difference. But what I wanted to do is drill down into the numbers a bit more, because I think this tells us where the problem still lies and where to solve it. So if you look at scam calls, they're way down. So the stuff that's obviously a scam call, it came from a spoof caller ID, it's impersonating somebody. This is great news. Where do you see an 80% decline over time? So this seems to be stir shaken, force people to get real numbers. There's a lot less spoofing. The regulators and enforcement have had an impact, right? You take out the 5 billion car warranty calls and the 5 billion healthcare calls, that starts really reducing spam and scams. The problem is that's not the only reason stuff's down. One reason it's down is the bad guys got a lot smarter.
Yeah.
There's a ton of evidence they're targeting now. They're not spraying and praying. They're going after targeted lists they get from the dark web or a data broker and go right after them. If you can go target 200,000 Alzheimer's patients, you don't have to target everybody over 65, right?
Exactly. It's targeting the vulnerable. They've done over the past few years the whole US population, because it's in each, it's like Atlanta, relatively small city, and they're like 155 million robocalls in a month. It's unbelievable. But what that's done is enabled them to troll through all the population in the US and find the vulnerable people. And then what's really heinous is targeting them multiple times.
Exactly. So that's one thing that's artificially lowering this number, I think.
Yeah.
And then the other is they've moved to SMS. So we're seeing a big movement of scams that used to start off as phone calls, starting off as text messages, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is still good news. There's fewer calls, but the why isn't as clear.
Exactly.
Okay. And here's the most interesting thing. So I took Truecaller's survey, which they did in 2021 and 2023, of how much they believed was lost based on their survey to robocalls. So if you look at 2021, call it 22 billion scam calls, They lost almost 40 billion. It's $1.81 a call the scammers made. And that's pretty profitable for a 1 penny or 2 penny call.
Yeah.
Look at 2023. Awesome. 8.1 billion scam calls, down almost 2/3. But 25.4 billion lost, only down 1/3.
Yeah.
You got 72% more profitable, $3.13 a call. Like, I don't actually care about the exact numbers here, but directionally, I think this is correct.
Yes, I agree.
Right? So this is the evidence that the scammers are targeting. They're getting more efficient because they're making more money. And any business that improves 72% in 2 years, people would be pretty stoked about. So
but they're getting there. They're getting through there through SMS. Look at the growth between SMS in the last couple of years.
And I am not even including SMS in this. This is just
all the scam money went to SMS. It's easier, it's quicker. What do you mean? All the fraud, the amount of money being stolen today is exponentially greater because of SMS. So a lot of those robocallers went to the targeting SMS. It's easier, it's quicker. People click on a link, money's gone. And we're not talking about SIM farms. That's where it's all coming from.
Exactly. So we have two problems. One is the movement to SMS, and like you're talking about, all the profit there, but they've gotten better at scamming through robocalls.
Yes.
Let's dig into the numbers just a bit more here, and then we'll talk about how to solve it.
Excellent.
Okay. Telemarketing's increased. So if you look at what we see at YouMail as telemarketing, it's up by almost 3x from where it was, right? If you go back 3.5 years. So why is this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. So one is some of this is scams in disguise. It used to be really easy to see a scam because of a spoof number. Now it takes longer. It's harder to detect. So the scams is artificially too low. The telemarketing is artificially too high. Fair enough. And we don't know exactly what that is, but you can still see the trend over time. It's going up even more than the scams have gone down.
Yeah.
The other thing we see is the telemarketers are making more call attempts. The same entity is calling from a bunch of different numbers. In fact, sometimes their behavior is indistinguishable from the bad guys. They're calling from a bunch of different local numbers. They're hanging up. They're doing all sorts of stuff that you don't think is great. And then lastly, it hasn't been the focus of enforcement. As much as there's TCPA stuff and all that, it isn't where the FCC is primarily focused with the stuff they've been doing. Yeah. So we have a problem here that from a consumer perspective, spam and scam calls are still high, right? Yeah. You put them together, the telemarketing, which isn't all bad, right? But it just from a consumer, you've got spam and telemarketing kind of staying flat. It doesn't feel like the problem was solved.
Correct.
And you can see there was a bit of a drop with Stir Shaken, great, but not since then, not much.
Yeah.
And in fact, you can actually, another way to look at this is, if you view that most unwanted calls are in the telemarketing and scam bucket, the good news is that used to be 2/3 of the calls. Now it's barely half, maybe even a little less the last couple months. And the notifications, which are the good calls, like the doctor's office, all that, are now half the calls. So your odds of picking up a decent call when you answer the phone are better, but it's not solved. If you're a consumer, it doesn't feel like this was solved.
Yeah.
Right. So that's where I'm coming from as I look at these numbers and I go, what if we really wanted to make a big dent so it was just wanted telemarketing and far fewer scams? What would we do? So I'm going to be very modest here and say, here's how I would, if I were king, I'd solve the robocall problem. I'd do 3 simple mandates, right? I'm not talking about how to do the mandates. I'm saying this is the mandate I would do. Okay, number 1. I would mandate that any auto-dialed call has to leave a compliant, like a TSR compliant voicemail when unanswered. No more hangups. Yeah. And the reason to target this is out of that massive number of robocalls, 2.5 billion are hangups. A hangup does no good to anybody. The phone rang and annoyed the consumer. They've now got a number they've got to deal with. It's not pleasant.
Yeah.
So let's look at that in some detail. If we made that rule, if it was possible to make that rule, it fundamentally changes the economics for robocallers. And that's because the simplest case is you had a 0.6 of a second call that might have cost a tiny fraction of a penny. Now it's going to be a 60-second call. By the time it listens to the greeting, drops a voicemail, does the whole thing, 10x more expensive to make calls, right? So that's a fundamental change. If you make it less profitable to make robocalls, you're going to get fewer of them. Really importantly, it stops the sneakiness of all these guys who hang up, hoping to get an answer. Now you're going to know who they are. You're going to know who these bad guys are, bad behaviors are. And from the perspective of a robocaller, it's a relatively light burden. You have to have an audio file that you deposit when you need a call. All these systems can detect voicemail. It's not a bad thing. It's also not a waste of time because the voicemails are now not something you have to listen to. They're transcribed, they're texted, etc. Okay, now let's look at it from the consumer perspective. Mystery calls essentially disappear, right? If everybody's following the mandate, every call is attached to exactly why they called, who called, why they called, how to stop the calls. That's good. You're going to get far fewer calls. There's no one's going to leave 10 voicemails that say the same thing. They'll leave a couple instead of all these hangups. And your calls are actionable. You can call back. You know why you got this call, that your subscription is hitting the end and you should either cancel it or renew it. It's a great consumer experience if you mandate this. And from an enforcement perspective, audio trails expose violators. You'll see really quickly who's misbehaving and pretending to be somebody they're not. It also exposes the ones who are hanging up all the time. Now carriers can just start blocking them. Hey, these numbers are hanging up. They're not following the law or the regulation or whatever the mandate is. Don't let them through. It becomes very easy at the carrier level to where short duration calls actually now are a problem. A lot of people are running around claiming, we should block all short duration calls. We don't know if it was legal or we don't know what happened. Now we'll know. Yeah. And then there's tons of evidence just sitting out there for the enforcement groups to actually take action. And little added bonus, the Ginzu knife thing, this makes carriers more money, right? Because hang-ups have the setup fees and all the rest of it. Yeah. There's a bunch of guys out there ringing 3 times. They never even connect, right? And so they're making all these calls that ring 3 times and hang up. Like that's got to go away, and carriers don't like those either.
Yeah.
So rule number 1, I think this is a simple rule. I think there's a bunch of legal arguments about whether or not you can do this. I'm going to stay away from that. Yeah. I'm just imagining I could do the rule. And I know Eric will tell me all the reasons we can't do this.
No, actually, Alex, just if I can pause there for a second, I like that idea. I like that idea. The problem is today is that there's actually the reverse or perverse incentive. The reason people hang up is because it's illegal to leave a voicemail. That's the irony, right? A call that is with a hang up does not trigger the same level of regulatory scrutiny and requirements that a pre-recorded voicemail does. So you are at a much higher risk as a caller leaving a voicemail than you are just hanging up. And it's not because you're hiding evidence or not being detected. It's because when you leave a voicemail, there are 10 different sets of laws that apply to that voicemail, including the requirement of express written consent that you wouldn't have had to have if you just attempted to call via your phone, let's say, and try to reach someone and then hung up when they didn't pick up the phone. So honestly, Alex, I love your idea. Just understand it is directly opposite to the current state of the law today.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's some challenges here. I've seen legal arguments for why you could do this, but we'll separate. That's over my pay grade. So let me talk about number 2. And so the second thing here is what I call the monitoring mandate, which is carriers must actively monitor for illegal and unlawful behavior of customers and partners. Yeah. They're not doing it now. There's some carriers doing it now, and they're really cleaning up their network. I did a talk at SIPNOC where I showed our partners have reduced illegal calls by 90% on average within 6 months by putting our monitoring in place. So it can be effective, but why do it if you don't have to? And so this is targeting the 1.5 billion robocalls a month from spam or unwanted telemarketing campaigns. You want the carriers to recognize when those things are happening.
Exactly, because as a consumer on T-Mobile, I've seen a massive drop in the spam likely notifications. Now it's like 1 or 2, maybe a day, rather than half my calls are spam likely.
And the question is that a good thing or a bad thing, right? Like, is it because T-Mobile has saying, I don't have any data, I don't know what's going on here anymore? Or is it because T-Mobile goes, no, that's actually somebody really good, I shouldn't be tell you who it is?
Less calls, less spam likely notifications. That's good as far as I'm concerned, because less interruptions.
Yeah, less calls for sure. That's the biggest thing. If you put a mandate where carriers have to pay attention, and I'll talk about how they can actually do it, there's fewer illegal calls, right? Yeah, that's what you want. You want the illegal and lawful calls to stop so the good ones can get through. Yeah. Carriers don't like this, right? There's a cost to comply. No one's going to monitor their traffic for free. They've got to take action. You can't bury your head in the sand. I think some carriers aren't monitoring now because they don't want to know. It's like, if I don't know, I'm better off than if I know and I didn't do something, right?
Because their legal departments are telling them shut up. Because the minute they open their mouth up, the regulatory, they start fining them. So
it's called
it's really
customer
a
focus,
convoluted
though.
mess.
No, it's not convoluted. It's customer focus. I'm paying the carrier for a service, the PSTN. It was once great 20 years ago. It's now crap. The service has been degraded. They need to do something. Otherwise, it's going to die. And we'll be all using sort of alternative technologies.
And I think that's the key here, right? That there are costs to comply. You have to take action. You're going to lose some revenue at first. Hopefully you make it up because now everybody's leaving voicemail.
Exactly.
But you're going to have a revenue loss to deal with. But consumers are way better off. And now enforcement. I mean, you can start blocking stuff at the network level. When the monitoring's saying this number is misbehaving and you know on the third call, you shut it off. That's 3 calls, not 3 million.
Exactly.
The fast shutdowns, the network blocking, those are huge advantages here if you're monitoring. So it's going to cost carriers, but the key thing here is illegal campaigns can't hit scale.
Yeah.
So I'm going to toot my own horn for 30 seconds. I'm not the only, YouMail is not the only tool here, but there are ways to monitor what's going on in the networks, right? In our case, we're answering calls for 20 million plus numbers now between our users and our honeypots. Carriers who are partners are showing here's how you identify stuff that hit your base that we started, right? It was ROCN, it's TN, CDRs, whatever it is. Yeah. Calls come in, they hit your base. You tell us which ones are us that were illegal. And you just have a loop. The minute they see on the dashboard, hey, there's a campaign here, they shut it off. And this is how you get a massive reduction because you're catching it early, not late. It's like a cancer, right? You want to catch cancer early before it spreads. Once a bad guy realizes they can get millions of calls, it becomes very hard to shut them off. They have all sorts of numbers, all sorts of carriers. You want to stop in the beginning. We're not the only solution. Like Frankel has one, right? With Raptor. There are other people who are doing this. I think ours is good, and there's a lot of reasons why people should use it. But once you have this in place, it makes a massive difference. Yeah. So 2 parts here, voicemail and monitoring mandates. Here's the third one, which I know Eric's going to have an allergic reaction to. I think I'm putting this up in part because it's radical and it can be pulled back, but this would stop the last problem. And this is make consent about a telephone number, not an entity. Why, when I consent, when I bought a car to get a satellite radio company calling me from any one of, who knows, 100,000, 500,000 numbers, that's crazy versus here's the one number I'm consenting to. You call me from this 800 number that you told me you're going to call me from, all good, right? And this is targeting our estimate based on data we're getting from our users. There's 1 billion calls a month made without consent right now. 300 plus million to 500 million scam calls, that this isn't going to affect those, but the 500 million-ish telemarketing calls that really look like they're being made without consent, our users are telling us when there's investigations, they find they didn't have legitimate consent. We've got to deal with that. Yeah. And so this is an interesting one because it's a bigger picture. It's a lot more change. But the idea is to make robocallers use persistent TNs. Why do you need 100,000 telephone numbers? 1 is fine. The reason that everybody moved from 1 is because people were blocking it, right? So, okay, let's call for a bunch. Now we can get through. Let's go back to 1, but you're not blocked unless you're doing something illegal. This is going to give better answer rates. Nobody's answering a local number now. If it's an 800 number with a clear identifier, kind of what they're trying to do with branded calling, people do answer the phone. And it is it's a big change to robocallers and how they keep consent. It's not just a random entity. It's about the phone number. Yeah. Now, from a consumer perspective, it's a lot fewer telephone numbers that are hitting you. Everybody's annoyed when there's this weird local number calling. Is that my daughter somewhere and she had to borrow a friend's phone? Or is it a robocaller, right? You don't know. And you kind of pick it up and end up talking to someone you don't want to. Consumers can easily block it. Now, consent revocation is, hey, I gave consent to that 1-800 number. I don't want that subscription service anymore. Block, it's done, right? They can't call me anymore. They only had consent from that one number. And it allows consumers to remember, hey, I consented to this number for a reason. I consented to this medical phone number calling me. I'm going to save it in my address book. It's going to get through. I know it's good. There's some real benefits to this approach. From an enforcement perspective, it immediately highlights bad telephone numbers. This telephone number is calling a lot, and consumers are saying didn't have consent. Remember, there's voicemail, there's monitoring. You're going to find it right away, which fast forwards enforcement dramatically. So this is probably too far along a path, but I think this would eliminate this whole I'm claiming consent. And it takes forever to get through the fake consent and all the other things that some of the bad guys are doing, which then wind up harming consumers. This kind of makes it easier to get to the bad guys to allow the good guys through. And look, 15 years ago, an 800 number called, you answered it.
Yeah.
If you figured it's somebody you wanted to talk to. Oh yeah, I'm shopping for a car. They called me. Great. Now it all goes to voicemail and people hang up for the compliance reasons that Eric mentioned. Yeah. So put me in charge, give me a little bit of a running room. 3 mandates: voicemail monitoring in some form of telephone number versus entity-based consent. I think that changes things dramatically so that robocalls get reduced quickly, and it's the ones that people want that get through. And I am all for good robocalls. I love the one from my doctor that reminds me to go, because if he sends me a text, it's in a huge list of stuff I'll never get to. But that call, oh, okay, at his office, there's a voicemail. Good. Thanks for the reminder. I'll make sure I go. Yeah. So there you go, guys. That's Alex is in charge, what he does.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Alex. Johnny, Eric, any questions for Alex?
I love Alex. Your last suggestion, it's not as crazy as it seems. I mean, to me, the last problem of the fake consents or the lack of consents for the marketing calls, as you know, that's what R.E.A.C.H is targeting, Alex. Like, that is our core. That billion that you put up, I agree with that number. I think it's about $1 billion a month is marketing calls that consumers have agreed to and didn't realize they agreed to it, or where lead generators are basically fraudulently suggesting a consent exists and the direct consumer marketer who makes the call doesn't know, right, that they don't have legitimate consent. They think it's a valid consent. Your approach of making this telephone number based, I mean, it's radical, but I'll be honest with you, Alex, I don't see it solving the underlying problem, which is consumers either being tricked into providing consent, not realizing they provided consent, or these lead providers just lying that they provided consent. Whether it's a phone number or a brand, that underlying root cause remains the same. Plus, I got to tell you, people don't memorize phone numbers; they do memorize brands, right? So your doctor's name, Wells Fargo's name, you might not know their phone number. So, but I don't want to poo-poo it though, because look, anything that anyone can come up with that's going to help to solve the problem of unwanted illegal calls, I am all for. Yeah. Where I get very concerned and my antenna goes up is when you're talking about censorship and content blocking and First Amendment issues where, carriers are empowered to engage in licensing schemes, going to your second point, and just stopping calls that they think are unwanted. Whereas I think you're very cautious in your talking points to talk about calls that are illegal. And I'm with you. If you could create a monitoring program where at a network level or otherwise, every single illegal call was blocked, I would support it fully. Unfortunately, today's paradigm is not looking at legality of calls. It's looking at other factors that don't turn on legality and most perniciously at content. Oh, you used the word loan, so I'm not going to let your text message go through. I mean, that's just terrible stuff, and we shouldn't have that. But anyway, I really appreciate your thoughts.
It's helpful for determining illegality, which is good, right? Like, this is an Amazon imposter. Amazon says they're not doing it. That's great, right? Get that stuff off the net. When it comes to consent, I'd actually even go a little further, where I would mandate there's a receipt for the consent that's sent to the consumer. So when you consent, you get a receipt. And then if you gave consent or not, right? And that you can click a button, add it to your address book, click another button to block it, et cetera. I think that's going to be a key part of this.
I love that.
I do think with monitoring, you're going to recognize the potential bad behavior really quickly. Like, I'm sure, I've gone car shopping, I've given consent for certain things. If I had a little email that said, you gave consent to these 4 dealers to call you from these 4 numbers, that's good enough. I'll remember it and I won't have a problem with it. So I think it's a starting point for a discussion on how do you actually try to solve the problem you mentioned, which is people calling without legitimate consent, right? Okay. They've confused the consumer, or they never had it at all and they just made it up. I think if you start forcing it to be numbers, everybody's going to be suspicious of calls from random numbers. And you're monitoring, you're going to see it. You're going to be able to pick those out and not waste time on other ones. So, to be determined. I think the whole point for me is to start a discussion and see, does it make sense to start going down these paths? Because I think this is the way we get from 4.5 billion to 2.5 billion, or some number that's what people want, right?
That's zero. That's what people want. Zero. only people are contacting me who I want to talk to.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I think Czar might bring you in on his cabinet that he's going to get a seat in a couple of weeks because it's going to be about free speech, as you all know. So I don't know. Czar, I'm not sure what you're going to decide, but I may want to give Alex a shot because he is, definitely doing the right thing out there. And Alex, just congratulations on Mike Rudolph getting another amazing with your team over there. I thought I saw Mike at the Mobile World Congress. I wasn't sure if it was him. But congratulations on that recent patent award that you guys have, and you continue to build that portfolio. And this is awesome. Alan's going to cut us off soon because he's got this thing called the schedule, which is really annoying. Because
otherwise, Johnny would talk over everybody.
I didn't talk once.
You were great. You were great this time.
And look, I'm the star of the show, like it or not. And I got the Czar, and I got Alex Quilici. Lyle Pratt, who you see there, is one handsome devil, and he's definitely in the lead of the Sexiest Man Award we have here at TADSummit Truth and Telecoms. But at the end of the day, look, you're going to get these two guys, two superstars like Alex and Eric J. Troutman on the same call. So I'm excited. I'm excited that I got these two guys here because if things are going to happen in this country, it's going to happen from these two guys, not me and you.
Absolutely. I agree.
At the end of the day.
Thank you guys for having me on. I got a schedule.
Go. Again,
I can't wait to put this session up because it's just blindingly amazing. Thank you both.